Welcome back. Let's talk GDP. Stats SA yesterday released the latest GDP figures for South Africa. Overall, GDP fell 7% in 2020. But there was some good news that actually baffled many. The economy recorded a better than expected 6.3% annualised growth rate in the fourth quarter of last year. Now, although the economy is expected to make a rebound from the coronavirus lockdowns, global ratings agency Standard & Poor's says South Africa's 2021 budget lacks focus on economic reforms, making a sustained rebound in our gross domestic product unlikely. Let's talk about this. Azar Jammine, Chief Economist at Econometrix, joins us this morning. Good to see you, Azar. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Leah, and good to be with you.
So let's go through some of the numbers, because I do believe, and I'm not sure if you were a part of the economists who were quite surprised by the fact that the overall GDP is down 7% in 2020. Many were expecting at least 10%, 8%, but it seems to have been better than expectations. Talk to us about this. Were you also a little bit surprised?
Not entirely. The 7% figure was more or less in the right ballpark. Even National Treasury in the bad budget forecast a 7.2% contraction, which is marginally worse than what actually happened. Essentially, what one needs to consider is that at the beginning of last year, everyone expected the economy to grow positively, albeit very weakly, by between 0 and 1%. Along came COVID, and the forecasts were revised downwards dramatically. And after levels 5 and 4, and the devastation that wreaked on the economy, with about half of the economy was shut down, basically, in level 5, people in that kind of mood revised their forecasts downwards massively to the -10, -12, -14% that you were suggesting. What happened subsequently, though, in the second half of the year was, as every lockdown restriction was gradually lifted, there was a real response in economic activity. And by the end of the year, we had seen that economic activity had recovered very nicely. And rather than looking at the quarter-on-quarter figures, one should rather look at the year-on-year, the same quarter compared with the quarter, a quarter versus the same quarter a year earlier. And if you look at it that way, we went from -17.5% in the second quarter to -5.9% in the third quarter to -4.1% in the fourth quarter. So that reflected how economic activity really did pick up. What was somewhat uncertain was the extent to which the renewed restrictions introduced on the 15th of December might have affected the fourth quarter figures somewhat. And what turned out to be the case was that the impact of some of the beach closures and so on, which took place right at the end of December, had less of a negative impact than most people had anticipated.
Quite surprisingly, actually, because I mean, there are a lot questioning how we actually managed to grow at 6.3% in the quarter four, given that we went into that hard lockdown again. Well, as hard as I suppose we'll go again. I don't imagine we'll ever get back.
I'm sorry, Leanne, I can't hear you.
Let's try again. How's the connection now? Azar, are we good? Can you hear me now?
Now it's fine. Yeah.
All right, much better.
Very clear.
Just saying, many questioning how we actually did grow at 6.3% in that fourth quarter, given the fact that we went into that tier 3 lockdown, which was quite hard, as you say. I mean, just before the Christmas break, people leaving beaches, holidays, everything just sort of, again, lots of money not being spent that could have been. But by then, most companies in manufacturing and services are already closed for the festive break, and manufacturing seems to have been the biggest winner here. So talk to us about that. Where is the growth?
Firstly, Leanne, you've got to bear in mind that, we saw quite a lot of restrictions being lifted in August and September, and in terms of provincial travel, and then from the 1st of October, international travel was allowed, and that kind of thing, and powers of association were eased somewhat. All of that filtered through into improving the situation in October and November and the beginning of December quite considerably. But there was a big external factor that also helped, and that was that at the beginning of November, Pfizer came out with the announcement that it had developed a vaccine. And internationally, this lifted sentiment quite dramatically. Over and above that, Joe Biden won the U.S. presidency. That was very well received. And together with that, there were expectations that were built up that he would invoke a huge fiscal stimulus that would actually get the U.S. economy going. And back in Asia, things were really booming quite nicely. They had recovered from the COVID-19 crisis very well. So all that combined to improve the atmosphere for exports quite considerably. Mineral exports soared because the prices of many of our minerals rocketed. And then non-mineral exports also did reasonably well because China started picking up and the rest of the world was also picking up.
Yeah. So again, let's have a look at some sectors. Manufacturing, as we know.
I can't hear you.
Let's try again. Manufacturing, good. Agriculture as well, and construction. These were the biggest drivers of growth for South Africa. Yet we were told that these sectors were the most hard hit because of the lockdown. No one seemed to be, doing massive building projects and things like that. Although clearly there was a lot of activity.
There was, and especially in some areas of the building activity, of the building industry, a lot of people started refurbishing their homes or establishing new workplaces out of town. And that resulted in quite a big uptick in the demand for building materials and that kind of thing. And that was also a spur to additional economic growth.
I laugh about it. I was speaking to a friend of mine who does tax returns and everything and, accounts and looking at the different kinds of companies. And she was just really interested to see how some of the businesses that she works with, obviously, those in tourism and those kind of industries were really, really struggling. But she said, just adding on to your point about people renovating homes, she said her interior designing business friends and those guys that have those businesses, they were flourishing over this time. For those that were working from home and were doing fixes and things, they, and could afford to, interior designing seemed to have been something that people really enjoyed.
There's no question that was an important factor. But even in the informal sector, the rollout of those special social grants of 350 Rand a month to 6 million unemployed persons who couldn't access ordinary social grants. That money seems to have filtered through into encouraging, even in those outlying areas, people who didn't have a job to do any longer to fix up their homes. And at the margin, that also helped boost the demand for some of these building materials like timber and cement and that kind of thing.
It's so nice to start digging into some of the positives because, at the end of the day, we are looking at these green shoots and we are hanging on to the positive news that's coming out of this because no matter what way we try and paint it into a rosy picture, it certainly isn't a rosy picture. I mean, we haven't been at levels like this since the 1920s. I mean, this is it's still a very difficult position we as South Africa find ourselves in. But, experts are urging South African companies to use this turnaround, this potential coming economic recovery, for the benefit to look internally as well. I mean, although there was a big call from the president yesterday to particularly look local, be proudly South African, keep on using the ability to buy local products and to stimulate the economy inside. And that's an important lesson I hope that we've learned from these lockdowns.
Yes, that is, but it does have a negative flip side. And we saw that during the apartheid era where we had economic sanctions imposed on the country and the government kept protecting industry against imported goods. And firstly, that restricted the variety of goods available internally. That's not a total disaster. But what it did have the effect of, perversely, was many of the local manufacturers simply grew to rely on government aid and assistance and high tariffs on imported, competitive imported products. And you ended up having much higher inflation and less economic growth. So I think you've got to do this inward industrialization in the right manner and not allow local industry just to become complacent in such an environment with government's help.
Azar, what are your views on this, the whole issue of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? I mean, is that something that, obviously where we're at and in terms of economic growth and looking for opportunities, is this something that you feel that, that a lot of companies should be looking into?
Yes, I think the important thing to bear in mind is that this slight revival in economic activity is not a panacea that will last indefinitely. I think we have to recognize that beyond, and that you kind of hinted at it with your statement that Standard & Poor's expressed dismay at the fact that not much was said in the budget about structural reforms. The fact is that if we do not address things like corruption, if we do not fix our state-owned enterprises, really get going this independent power producers to produce electricity, introduce broadband spectrum, if we do not improve our educational system, and if we do not embark upon massive infrastructural investment that we desperately need, and that is a source of job creation, come 2022, our economic growth rate will fall back to what it was prior to the COVID-19 crisis. And many people forget that we were already in a recession, albeit mild in comparison with what subsequently occurred. We were already in a recession prior to the onset of the COVID-19 crisis.
I mean, and that's something we must never sort of keep away from the analysis of the South African economy. We were already here. We were just pushed much further due to coronavirus. I just want to look at some comments. You mentioned S&P. The analyst there, Ravi Bhatia, actually saying that the budget was more of a fiscal control exercise than a real attempt at structural reform. Do you think that this is a fair comment?
I think it's a fair comment, but one must also bear in mind that I don't know whether it was the function of the budget necessarily to talk about the structural reforms. Those were elucidated by none other than President Ramaphosa, firstly in October with his Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan address, then in the ANC's January the 8th birthday celebratory speech, and then in the State of the Nation address. I think it's possibly a little harsh to expect to have heard too much about structural reforms in the budget itself, which was no doubt a fiscal consolidation exercise or an attempt to try and convince people that the government wasn't really serious about reining in its expenditure and reducing budget deficits and public debt.
Azar, just quickly wrapping things up, again, looking at S&P and what they were saying, they really specifically made mention to this uncontrolled public sector wage bill, and that's something that I know is a big problem, and of course government spending on projects. Again, another thing that they highlight, the spending projects were an attempt to boost the economy, no doubt, but where are we? I mean, just let's get a little bit of forward thinking from you in terms of the year ahead. Are you optimistic? I mean, obviously COVID is still very much so with us. Whether we are in a trial phase of the vaccines or we're actually doing a vaccine rollout, there's still a little bit of a blurred line there. But in comparison to the rest of the world, we really are nowhere when it comes to the vaccine. We've got winter coming. What are you thinking in terms of the economy? I mean, where do you think we're going?
Firstly, from a short-term point of view, I'm very encouraged by the latest infection and death rates from COVID. We have seen these declining far, far faster than what is going on internationally. Yes, there is this warning about the third wave, and one has to take it very seriously in the winter, and that could have a negative effect. But you've got to bear in mind that we've also learned from last year that embarking upon lockdowns as strict as levels 5 and 4 were really counterproductive. We could have probably achieved as much without locking the economy down quite so severely. So I do not expect us to have a resumption of lockdown restrictions anywhere close to what we experienced during 2020. The second point to bear in mind, a lot depends on this global economy. If the exuberance that currently exists lasts the rest of the year, this will also assist in our economic promoting our exports and sustaining our economic growth at a higher level than we might have anticipated. But there are some huge risks, and that is that the world leaders may be overstimulating the world economy, and that could result in a major downturn in global economic activity later in the year, which could redound negatively on us. The third area of positivity is purely statistical. You've got to bear in mind that last year's performance was so abysmal, especially in the second quarter, that when we come to the second quarter of this year, we will be comparing against such a low base that we are of necessity going to see positive growth in most of our activities. My concern relates not so much to 2021 as to the scenario beyond 2021. And here one is very concerned that there's political pushback against attempts by the government with the policies that it has actually elucidated in terms of economic recovery and structural reform. There is pushback from within the ruling party caused by factional interests, where politicians are putting their own interests way ahead of those of the majority of people in the country. And my concern is, will we be able to ensure that beyond 2021, we see an improvement in our economic growth compared with what we had prior to the COVID-19 crisis?
Right, Azar, thanks so much for your views this morning. Chief Economist at Econometrix, Azar Jammine, speaking to us about Stats SA, yesterday releasing the latest GDP figures for South Africa. Overall, GDP fell 7% in 2020, but the economy recorded a better than expected 6.3% annualized growth rate in the fourth quarter of the year. Right, before we take a break, let's quickly look at our question.